Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Have History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time Burnside was sent to Ohio and Kentucky to look over the Midwestern states and the Bluegrass State. Now he moves into East Tennessee. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, or purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. With John Hunt Morgan captured in Ohio, Ambrose Burnside could concentrate more of his troops toward an invasion of East Tennessee. He still asked General-in-Chief Henry Halleck for his Ninth Corps back from their expedition to Vicksburg. Once that city fell, they now became available in early August 1863. However, the Ninth Corps wasn't the unit it was when it left. It departed Burnside with about 8,000 healthy soldiers. It returned to him with around 6,000 men in it, and a great deal of those 6,000 were too sick for duty or too worn down from campaigning to be much help to Burnside. Nevertheless, they reached him by mid-August. Burnside moved his headquarters from Cincinnati and into the field as he began preparations for a move into Tennessee. He rode by train to Lexington, Louisville, and then back to Lexington, and finally to Camp Nelson. The fortified camp, located just south of Lexington, would act as his supply depot for his troops as he moved into the Appalachian Mountains. He was at Camp Nelson when John G. Parke, his former chief of staff and now commander of the Ninth Corps, arrived to discuss his corps' next steps. Burnside and his staff found Parke emaciated and with a fever from the Vicksburg campaign. Without a moment's hesitation, Burnside knew Parke and his command couldn't join him on this journey and sent Parke to recuperate in Cincinnati. Union Major General William S. Rosecrans and his Army of the Cumberland was moving against Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee toward Chattanooga, and Burnside needed to connect to and protect that army's left flank, but he knew the movement through the Appalachian Mountains would be difficult. Over 2 years of war had ravaged the area and taken from it the little it could provide. So instead of moving as 1 or 2 columns through the terrain, he broke his 8,000 men, over half of which was mounted, into 5 marching columns to traverse the mountains. Part of his command moved out on their invasion on August 20th, with the rest following shortly after. The 23rd Corps with Burnside struggled over the mountains. Even on horseback, Burnside and his staff had difficulty climbing the steep terrain. The Confederate force opposing him was Major General Simon Bolivar Buckner's Army of East Tennessee, which was spread out over its namesake region, and with Rosecrans moving toward Chattanooga, Braxton Bragg ordered Buckner to concentrate his force and move toward that city. This left only a scattering of soldiers in East Tennessee, with the largest contingent at Cumberland Gap, which contained a little over 2,000 men. In less than 2 weeks, Burnside's Army of Liberation made it to the outskirts of Knoxville, the capital of East Tennessee. They entered the city and became surrounded by thankful citizens with tears in their eyes and streaming down their cheek. For over 2 years, Unionists in the region had been beaten, murdered, and ran out of the state. Many of them went to Knoxville hoping it gave some level of protection, but they still had to hide their loyalty. When Burnside entered the city, the people rejoiced, running up to him, wanting to touch him and his horse. They came out from their houses with food and water to give to the soldiers. It was a joyous occasion that those Tennesseans would never forget. The people demanded a speech. The next day he went out onto a balcony of the building he commandeered and stumbled through a few words, not being inclined to make speeches, but the crowd loved it nonetheless. One man wrote that Burnside was an honest, noble man. He had a heart and spoke from it. Despite the celebrations, Burnside had much more work to do. First, the Gap's garrison still hadn't surrendered. It was now completely surrounded but refused to capitulate. Burnside sped himself north with another brigade of troops, covering the 60 miles in about 52 hours. He sent his aide to deliver the surrender terms to the Confederate commander, and with Burnside's name written on the bottom, that meant Knoxville had been taken and no other help was going to come. So he surrendered to Burnside on September 9th, 1863, at 3 p.m. With his invasion, Burnside liberated East Tennessee and conquered a significant amount of territory. Burnside considered his job over. With this success under his belt, asked President Lincoln if he could go home, because he believed someone else could do the job just as well as him or better. Lincoln appreciated the humble general, but wanted him to stay on, and Burnside agreed to stay on as requested. Indeed, his job wasn't done. The Confederate commander of the Department of Southwest Virginia was sending as many troops as he could to harass Burnside's 23rd Corps as it spread out over the region from Knoxville to Jonesboro. Word came just a few days after Burnside arrived in Knoxville that Robert E. Lee was sending an entire corps to confront him, allegedly being Richard Ewell's corps. There was a kernel of truth in those reports. Lee was sending a corps west, but it was Longstreet's corps, and it wasn't heading for Burnside. It was going to reinforce Bragg in Georgia. Burnside grew concerned and dispatched troops to watch over the region and guard main roadways from Virginia into Tennessee. He also waited impatiently for his Ninth Corps to appear. A concentration of rebel forces near Jonesboro brought Burnside into a dilemma. Would he be able to link up with Rosecrans and give him reinforcements, or would he attack the enemy at Jonesboro that threatened his holding of the region? He was trying to do both, sending a portion of his force south to Rosecrans, but they hadn't made it to the Army of the Cumberland. Burnside was able to bluff the rebels at Jonesboro, but there was still a force in his region of occupation. President Lincoln and Halleck sent Burnside messages to make a junction with Rosecrans. The delay in communication resulted in a concerning moment for Lincoln. Burnside responded on September 19th to Halleck's message from a week before, stating that he was headed to Jonesboro. Lincoln became enraged because Burnside was heading in the opposite direction of Rosecrans's army and cursed Jonesboro. After receiving repeated explanations of why Burnside couldn't link up with Rosecrans, Lincoln wrote to Burnside, "Yours of the 23rd is just received, and it makes me doubt whether I am awake or dreaming." However, this message was never sent. In defense of Burnside, one of his biographers wrote, "In fact, even if Burnside had abandoned all of East Tennessee the morning of September 17th, even if he had ignored his own supply line and the threat of Sam Jones at his rear, and even if he had overcome the Confederates who stood to resist him to the south, he could never have supplied Rosecrans a single rifleman before the disaster of September 20th at Chickamauga. The bulk of his troops would have arrived long after the defeat in an exhausted condition and without supplies. East Tennessee would have been lost for nothing, and Burnside's army would only have further taxed Rosecrans's already strained supply line. No one has ever pointed out what a fortuitous event it was that Burnside could not comply with Halleck's and Lincoln's wishes. Ultimately, Burnside had too many enemy threats in East Tennessee to divert his attention or his troops to Rosecrans. A Confederate contingent sent from the Department of Southwest Virginia began making their way southwest from Bristol, and Burnside determined to meet it, especially since his Ninth Corps troops were now in the region. The Corps wasn't what it used to be, but it was a determined fighting force. On October 9th, Burnside sped by rail to Morristown, where he and his staff huddled under a makeshift lean-to made up of shelter halves with fires burning at both ends. Burnside sat in the middle as his staff encircled him as they ate. The next day, the Ninth Corps made it to Morristown, and when they saw their old commander, they began to cheer uncontrollably. Burnside uncovered his head and rode out in front of them to show his appreciation for their support and in recognition of their determination. Burnside threw back and chased the Confederates, but couldn't launch a successful pursuit. He then retired to Knoxville. Around the same time that Burnside was chasing Confederates out of his newly captured region, Ulysses S. Grant took command of the Military Division of the Mississippi, which gave him command of basically all Union forces between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. This put an added layer of bureaucracy between Burnside and Washington, which Burnside liked. Burnside hoped that with Grant in command, he could better serve the Army's needs. The first thing Grant wanted to know from Burnside was how many men he had and how they were distributed. Burnside had around 15,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry. However, those numbers are misleading. Those are the troops present for duty, but because of the nature of the Appalachian Mountains, Burnside had to station large sections of troops at vital locations. For example, 2,000 men garrisoned Cumberland Gap. 4 garrisons were needed to guard the railroad from Knoxville to Morristown, which needed around 9,000 men. Then there was the defenses of Knoxville that needed to be manned, plus all of the escorts bringing supplies over the mountains into East Tennessee. Ultimately, Burnside had only a mobile force of around 5,000 men. However, a swell of new recruits from the Unionist citizens of North Carolina and Tennessee began streaming into Knoxville and other locations. Somewhere around 3,000 men had or were in the process of enlisting in the Union Army since Burnside arrived. An attack near Loudon, Tennessee, by a significant Confederate force under Carter Stevenson led Burnside to grab his aides and board a train in a torrential downpour for the town. It took hours to get there because the engineer was afraid he might derail if he went too fast and hit a washed-out section of track. When the group arrived in Loudon, the rain was still coming down and they hadn't eaten in 14 hours, so no one left the rail car, and they called on Paul, the general's chef. The chef produced a sizzling pan of beefsteak, boiled chicken, and hardtack with butter on it, and a pot of hot coffee. The staff planted candles on the arms of the seats and began eating. Then, with the food all gone, they all joined in a game of cards until 2 a.m., when they curled up in their jackets, two to a seat, and went to sleep. Seeing no real threat around Loudon, Burnside and his staff moved back to Knoxville, where they were met with a luxurious living from the Unionists, who attempted to bribe the Federal soldiers from leaving by giving them vast amounts of food. However, their luxury would be short-lived. Confederate Lieutenant General James Longstreet was on the move from Chattanooga. Bragg had dispatched him from the partial siege of that town to deal with Burnside. As Longstreet approached one of Burnside's divisions at Loudon, Burnside had a decision. Would they contest the crossing of the Tennessee River? Burnside decided against such a tactic. That would have been the easier option and probably defeated Longstreet before he got to Knoxville, but that also ran the risk of allowing Longstreet to return to Bragg's army and reinforce the Army of Tennessee against Grant at Chattanooga. Burnside wanted to draw Longstreet further north and away from Bragg to help Grant defeat Bragg. Burnside fought a delay in action as Longstreet pushed toward Knoxville. Small battles erupted around Loudon, Lenore Station, and Campbell Station as the gray tide crept toward the city. Once in Knoxville, Burnside called on his chief engineer Orlando Poe and newly minted Brigadier General William P. Sanders to his headquarters. Burnside asked Poe how long he would need to complete the fortifications. Poe said at least by noon the next day. Burnside then asked Sanders whether he could delay Longstreet until that time. Sanders assured him that he could. Sanders and Poe had known each other at West Point and were friends, and shared quarters that night. Sanders awoke before dawn and headed out to delay the rebels for as long as he needed. While holding the line into the afternoon, Sanders would be killed rallying his men. The rest of the Federals sprinted into the earthworks, and Longstreet began a siege. Henry Halleck, the general-in-chief who had given Burnside so much trouble thus far, looked on the situation in East Tennessee as bleak and advised Grant to relieve Knoxville, but Grant trusted Burnside. As one of Burnside's biographers put it, unlike General Halleck, whose conflicting instructions seemed designed more to please those above him than inform those below him, Grant was willing to take responsibility for the orders he issued. That had become clear November 15th, when he told Burnside to hold East Tennessee even at the cost of most of his army. Also unlike Halleck, Grant never hesitated to encourage a dangerous course of action if it promised a fair chance of success. When Burnside pulled inside the protection of the forts, he found a message from Chattanooga telling him, "You are doing what appears to me exactly right." Grant had a reputation, too, for quick, decisive action, and when he assured Burnside that he would immediately either draw Longstreet off or send a force to relieve him, Burnside could believe him. For the first time in 14 months, he could trust the next man above him. Burnside came out with a telescope to observe the Confederate movements from some breastworks guarding the city. As he scanned the landscape, a team of white horses pulled a rebel gun into place on a ridge opposite them. It fired 3 shots at Burnside. One careened through a tent, scaring the life out of the inhabitant. The next went through a door of a house. The third passed pretty close to Burnside himself. Burnside gritted his teeth and took control of a single gun, aiming it properly and then giving the order to fire. The shell injured the gun, and the white horses pulled it away. With Confederates on both sides of the river and surrounding Burnside's fortifications around the city, the siege brought about tremendous suffering. Coffee and sugar had to be withheld for 4 days and spared for the hospitals. The great amount of supplies coming in from citizens had come in from the south side of the river in general, and with the Confederates on that side, it meant no more luxurious meals for Burnside's men. To relieve the pressure on forage for the animals, Burnside ordered all of the used-up animals to be taken down to the river and shot, pushing their carcasses into the water. This would conserve the food for the animals capable of pulling ordnance and supply wagons. On the morning of November 29th, Longstreet launched his attack against Burnside's fortifications by assaulting Fort Sanders. What resulted was a quick but brutal fight that saw Longstreet's men get trapped in a ditch in front of the fort. It was a great victory for Burnside. Quickly, the victorious general sent over a flag of truce to instruct Longstreet to retrieve his dead and dying. Although it goes to prove his humanitarian efforts, Burnside also knew that taking care of the Confederate wounded would strain his medical supplies. If Longstreet took care of his own wounded, it would slow down the Confederates and use up their own resources. Longstreet soon pulled his men away from Knoxville. William T. Sherman, Grant's right-hand man, pressed northward from Chattanooga after Union forces there soundly defeated the Confederate Army of Tennessee. Sherman's goal was to help Burnside throw back Longstreet's corps. A grueling march brought Sherman to Knoxville, where, when he crossed the river, he saw a fine herd of beef cattle penned up. As he entered the fine home that was Burnside's headquarters, he found a roast turkey dinner waiting on him. He told Burnside that he had heard that Knoxville was under dire straits and was probably on their last cracker. Burnside explained that access to the French Broad River area allowed him to gain a substantial amount of food after the siege. However, Burnside failed to inform Sherman that he and his staff had to scrape together from all over the city enough food to make the turkey dinner presented. With Longstreet withdrawing east, Sherman asked Burnside if he would like to use General Gordon Granger's 4th Corps to pursue him. Granger complained that his men were too tired from their march to pursue, so Burnside asked for Granger's men to take the Army of the Ohio's place in the entrenchments around Knoxville, while Burnside's 23rd Corps of that army pursued Longstreet. That was agreed upon, and John G. Parke led the corps after the rebel, while the 4th Corps remained at Knoxville, and Sherman rode back to Chattanooga. Longstreet turned on Parke at Bean Station in the shadow of Clinch Mountain and defeated his Union counterpart, but Parke simply withdrew a few miles to Blaine's Crossroads. Fighting ended, and both sides started preparations for winter quarters in East Tennessee. Before the Battle of Bean Station took place, Burnside was already replaced as commander of East Tennessee. He had complained earlier to Abraham Lincoln that a Mexican ailment picked up during the Mexican-American War was returning to him regularly, probably induced by the stress of command. Although he had recovered from his ailment by the time he was replaced, Burnside gladly handed over command to his old friend and subordinate John G. Foster, then proceeded north to Kentucky using Big Creek Gap. He and his staff forded the Cumberland River, getting absolutely soaked because of the river and the rain beating down on them. Making it to the Ohio River, Burnside headed east, where he linked up with Mary. Burnside went to New York City, where he heard an amusing story. During the Battle of Fort Sanders, word was telegraphed, probably from Union forces north of Knoxville near Cumberland Gap, that firing was heard at Knoxville. An aide brought that news to Lincoln, who was thrilled to hear of the fighting. When those around him inquired as to why that was a good thing, Lincoln told them a story of a woman named Sally Ward he once knew that had a house full of children. Whenever someone would come to her and say they heard one of her children crying somewhere, she would say, "Ah, there's one of my children that isn't dead yet." The story was a compliment to Burnside, meaning that he was showing action. Thus Lincoln was less concerned about the situation. The president worried about the generals he heard little from. The Burnsides then headed to Rhode Island for the holidays. For the first time since 1860, Burnside warmed his feet by the fire in his own home at Christmas time.